Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're tackling a story that, honestly, it just boggles my mind just starting to read through it. Imagine fighting for your basic rights for like a decade. You know, winning repeatedly, even getting all the way up to the highest court and still being blocked at every turn from getting justice. That's exactly what's happening right now to a group of estate constables who were let go from RBC RBTT Bank way back in 2014.
Yeah, this is definitely a case that really, I think, brings to light the complexities and, the potential pitfalls of the legal system, even when the facts of the case seem pretty straightforward.
Okay, so for people who aren't familiar with the state constables, what exactly do they do? I mean, they're responsible for security and law enforcement within the bank.
Exactly. So they're not just your average security guard. They actually have the authority to make arrests and enforce the law within the organization. So when they're the ones facing injustice, it really raises some questions about how well the system protects those who are supposed to be protecting us.
Right. Yeah, it's like a breach of trust almost. So let's go back to the beginning. This all started in May 2014 when these officers were retrenched. What happened next?
Well, right off the bat, we see the first sign of trouble. The case was filed under the wrong category at the Ministry of Labor.
So a technicality, right. But how much of an impact did that have on the case?
It might seem like a small detail, but it actually weakens their legal standing from the very start. And that, coupled with the fact that it took a whole year for the case to even reach the industrial court, really sets the tone for what's to come.
A whole year. Geez, I can't even imagine that waiting period, the stress. So March 2017, we finally have that first tribunal hearing. This is where it starts to get a little bit tricky, right? I've heard there were some serious missteps by the organization that's supposed to be representing these officers, the State Police Association, the EPA.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The EPA's actions during that initial hearing are puzzling, to say the least. Instead of focusing on the wrongful dismissal due to redundancy, which is really the crux of the issue, they decided to argue an entirely different legal point that was ultimately irrelevant to the case.
Why would they do that? I mean, were they just incompetent, or is there something more to it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was this a case of simple negligence, or could there be other reasons, strategic or otherwise, behind the EPA's decision-making? It's a crucial question to consider because, remember, the EPA, their sole purpose is to advocate for these officers to protect their rights.
Right, and it almost seems like they did the opposite. So what were the consequences of this misdirection, let's call it?
Well, it created a lot of confusion and allowed the tribunal to basically sidestep the main issue of wrongful dismissal. And to make matters worse, there's a really critical detail that emerged from that hearing, a detail that was conveniently omitted from the official records.
Uh-oh. Red flags. What was missing?
The tribunal chairman actually instructed the EPA to go back to the bank and try to negotiate a settlement.
Hold on. So a direct instruction from the chairman himself. And that wasn't documented. Why would that be left out?
That's the question, isn't it? This omission had a huge impact on how the case proceeded. It essentially misled the courts in all the following proceedings, like trying to solve a puzzle when a key piece is hidden.
I'm starting to see how this went on for so long. So we've got this misrepresented case, we have delays, and now this key piece of information goes missing.
Exactly. And as if that wasn't enough, in January 2018, the tribunal dismissed the entire case, citing a lack of jurisdiction.
Based on?
This dismissal was based on this idea that a branch board was required, which stemmed directly from the missing information, the distorted facts presented from that first hearing. So it's like they built a case against these officers on a foundation of quicksand.
That's unbelievable. And I'm guessing it doesn't end there.
Of course not. In April 2018, the EPA's legal representative filed an affidavit for judicial review.
Okay, now an affidavit, that's a sworn statement, right? That has to be accurate.
Exactly. An affidavit is a legal document where you present the facts of a case truthfully and accurately. But in this case, the affidavit filed by the EPA's legal rep contained incorrect information about what really happened at that initial tribunal hearing.
Wait, they submitted evidence that wasn't true? That seems like a pretty big deal. Was this intentional or just another case of incompetence?
It's tough to say for sure. But regardless of the intent, the effect was the same. It created more confusion, misled the courts, and ultimately delayed justice for these estate constables. And this whole situation really highlights the importance of accurate and truthful information in legal proceedings. I mean, the integrity of the entire system hinges on that.
It just blows my mind that something like that could happen. Mishandling of the case, delays, potentially false evidence. It really doesn't paint a good picture of how the system protects workers, does it?
It's definitely a cause for concern, right? If this can happen in such a high-profile case, what's happening in those cases that don't get this much attention? But, amidst all of this, we can't lose sight of the human element here.
That's right. We're not just talking about legal technicalities. This is about real people whose lives have been turned upside down because of this wrongful retrenchment. How do you think this decade-long battle has affected them?
Well, put yourself in their shoes for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine the stress, the financial strain, the emotional toll of fighting for your rights for years with no resolution in sight. This is not just about getting their jobs back. It's about restoring their dignity, their sense of justice. And you have to consider the impact on their professional reputations. It's probably been really difficult for them to find new employment. And the impact on their families, their personal lives, it's immeasurable.
That's heartbreaking. So at this point, the case has been mishandled, delayed, potentially undermined. What happens next? Do the estate constables ever catch a break?
They do, and it comes in July 2021 when the Court of Appeal overturns the tribunal's ruling.
Finally a victory. So it sounds like justice is starting to prevail.
Yeah, it felt like a real turning point in the case. The Court of Appeal's ruling was clear, and it seemed like the estate constables were finally on the path to getting the justice they deserved. But of course, with this case, there's a twist.
Oh, no, not another one. What happened?
Despite the Court of Appeal's clear and justified ruling, the Attorney General at the time allowed the tribunal to appeal the decision to the Privy Council.
The Privy Council, that's the highest court of appeal for many Commonwealth countries, right? Why would the Attorney General allow an appeal when the lower court's errors were so obvious?
Yeah, it's a decision that raises serious questions about the Attorney General's judgment and potential biases. Allowing this appeal, despite the misleading arguments presented by the tribunal, it really sets a dangerous precedent. It undermines the authority of the Court of Appeal. This is something that could have a ripple effect on future cases.
Wow. So the fight wasn't over. These estate constables are now facing the highest court in the land. What were their chances at that point?
Well, despite all the roadblocks and setbacks, they had a strong case. In May 2024, the Privy Council ruled in favor of the estate constables. It was a resounding victory, acknowledged the injustices they had endured. And the Privy Council even went a step further. They mandated that a new panel be formed to hear the case. They recognized the inherent problems with the previous tribunal.
That's incredible. You'd think that after a decade of fighting and winning at the highest court that this would finally be the end of it, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But this story is full of surprises. Despite the Privy Council's explicit instructions for a new panel, guess who remained in charge?
No way. The same chairman who had been overseeing this whole thing.
You got it. It's almost unbelievable, right? The Privy Council specifically states that a new panel is needed, and yet this same chairman, who's already shown some questionable judgment in this case, remains in control.
It's almost as if they just ignored the Privy Council's ruling completely. It makes you wonder about the checks and balances in the system. So what happens next? Did the estate constables just accept this?
Well, understandably, they were wary. Given the EPA's track record so far, the estate constables decided to seek new legal representation. They found a lawyer who was ready and willing to take on their case.
And I'm sensing this didn't go over very well.
You're catching on. The EPA stalled the approval process for months, creating more roadblocks for these officers who are simply trying to exercise their right to have competent legal counsel. They offered up excuse after excuse, delaying tactics, anything to keep the estate constables from getting proper representation.
A pattern of obstruction. Remember that upcoming hearing we mentioned, the one scheduled for April 7th through the 11th? Were they able to secure new representation in time?
That is the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, we don't have a definitive answer. The EPA's actions put them in a very precarious position. Imagine winning your case at the highest court, but then being denied the ability to actually benefit from that victory.
It's just absurd. A complete failure of the system. And speaking of failures, we can't forget about those missing verbatim notes from the initial tribunal hearing. What was in those notes, and why were they hidden?
Ah, yes, the verbatim notes, a crucial piece of the puzzle. These notes, essentially a transcript of that first hearing, contained the chairman's instruction to the EPA to renegotiate with the bank. But they were conveniently misplaced and not made available until much later in the proceedings.
Misplaced, I think that's a nice way of saying deliberately withheld. Why would someone go to such lengths to hide these notes? What impact did their absence have on the case?
The impact was huge. If those notes had been available from the beginning, they would have blown the whole case wide open. It would have shown that the tribunal chairman himself had directed the EPA to take a different course of action, an instruction that they conveniently ignored.
So by withholding these crucial notes, someone was able to manipulate the legal process and keep these estate constables trapped in this decade-long fight. But who benefits from this?
That is the question that we need to be asking. Who had the most to gain from delaying justice in this case? Was it simply incompetence, or was there a deliberate attempt to protect powerful interests at the expense of these estate constables?
It's a crazy story, right? So much going on. But,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, this is about people's lives, right? These are individuals who have been through a lot. It's been, 10 years now?
Yeah, I mean, it really is mind-boggling when you think about the human impact here. These aren't just legal cases. They're real people with families and careers and lives that have been completely disrupted.
And this whole ordeal has to have taken such a huge toll on them, emotionally, financially, not to mention the damage to their professional reputations.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine the stress of being wrongfully dismissed from your job and then having to fight tooth and nail for a decade just to get some semblance of justice. It's got to be incredibly demoralizing.
I can only imagine. So let's get back to the case. At this point, we've got mishandling delays, potentially false evidence. It's a lot to process. Where do we go from here? Did the estate constables ever catch a break?
They did, actually. In July 2021, the Court of Appeal overturned the tribunal's ruling.
Finally, right. So justice is starting to prevail.
Yeah, it really felt like a turning point. The Court of Appeal's decision was pretty clear-cut. They acknowledged the errors in the tribunal's reasoning and basically confirmed that the officers had been denied a fair hearing. It seemed like they were finally on the right track.
It's about time. But knowing this case, I'm sure there's another twist coming, right?
You know it. This story just keeps on giving. So despite this victory at the Court of Appeal, the Attorney General at the time made a pretty controversial decision.
Oh boy, what did he do?
They allowed the tribunal to appeal the case to the Privy Council.
Hold on a second. The Privy Council, that's the highest court of appeal in the Commonwealth, isn't it? Why would the Attorney General allow an appeal when the Court of Appeal had already set things straight?
Well, that's a good question, and it's one that a lot of people were asking at the time. Some saw it as a sign of potential bias, or maybe even an attempt to protect certain interests.
It definitely raises some red flags. So the estate constables, they're now going up against the highest court there is. What were the odds looking like at this stage?
Well, despite everything they had been through and all the roadblocks they had encountered, they still had a strong case. And in May 2024, the Privy Council ruled in their favor.
Wow, they won.
Yeah, it was a resounding victory. They acknowledged the injustices the estate constables had faced over the years, and they didn't stop there. The Privy Council also mandated that a brand new panel be formed to hear the case. They recognized that the previous tribunal was just too compromised to ensure a fair hearing.
It's amazing that they were able to pull that off. You'd think that after all these years and a victory at the highest court possible, this would be the end of their ordeal, right?
You would think so, wouldn't you? But this story is full of surprises. Despite the Privy Council's very specific instructions to form a new panel for the case, guess who stayed in charge?
You're kidding me, right? It was the same chairman.
Yep, you guessed it. The same chairman who had been overseeing the case from the very beginning remained in his position. It's almost as if the Privy Council's ruling meant absolutely nothing.
It's unbelievable, really. It makes you question whether there are any real checks and balances in the system at all. So what did the estate constables do? Did they just give up at this point?
Well, understandably, they were skeptical about going forward with the same chairman. I mean, they had every right to be concerned. And given the EPA's track record so far, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They sought out new legal representation, someone who they believed could truly fight for their rights.
And I'm guessing the EPA didn't just roll over and let that happen.
You're right on the money. The EPA stalled the approval process for months, coming up with all sorts of excuses and delaying tactics.
So even after a decade of fighting and a landmark victory at the Privy Council, they were still being stonewalled at every turn.
Exactly. They had to jump through hoop after hoop just to exercise their basic right to choose their own legal counsel. It was a blatant attempt to obstruct justice.
This whole situation is just so frustrating. So what happened with that upcoming hearing, the one scheduled for April 7th through the 11th? Were the estate constables able to secure new legal representation in time?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, we don't have a clear answer. The EPA's actions put them in a really tough spot. I mean, Imagine winning your case at the highest court and then being denied the ability to actually benefit from that victory. It's a cruel twist of fate.
It's just beyond belief. And let's not forget about those missing verbatim notes from the initial tribunal hearing. Those were never found, right? What exactly was in those notes, and why do you think someone would go to such lengths to hide them?
The verbatim notes. That's a great question. Those notes were essentially a transcript of that very first hearing,
Yeah.
and they contained some pretty damning information. They revealed that the chairman himself had instructed the EPA to go back and try to negotiate a settlement with the bank.
Wait, so the chairman himself gave that instruction and it was never documented?
Nope. And the EPA never followed through on it either.
So, by hiding those notes, someone was able to completely manipulate the narrative of the case and keep these estate constables trapped in this legal limbo for years.
It's a classic case of information control. And it raises some serious questions about who was really pulling the strings behind the scenes. Was it just incompetence, or was there a more sinister motive at play?
Well, that's something we'll have to explore further. This case has certainly taken us down a rabbit hole of intrigue and corruption, and it makes you wonder how many other cases like this are out there, cases where the truth has been buried and justice has been delayed or denied altogether.
That's a sobering thought, and it underscores the importance of holding those in power accountable and demanding transparency in all legal proceedings.
It really is a crazy story, isn't it? We've uncovered some pretty shocking details about this case, from the EPA's questionable actions to those missing verbatim notes and that chairman who just wouldn't budge. Where do we even begin to make sense of all of this?
Well, I think it's important to always bring it back to the human element.
Yeah.
We can get lost in the legal weeds, but at the end of the day, this is about real people whose lives have been deeply affected by this whole ordeal.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in all the twists and turns of the case, but these are individuals who have faced real hardship, financial strain, emotional distress, damage to their reputations. What would you say to someone who's been through something like this?
I would say that their experience matters. Their story deserves to be heard. Fighting for justice is never easy, and going up against a system that seems rigged against you can be incredibly demoralizing. But they're not alone, and cases like this highlight those systemic issues that can affect anyone. And by speaking out, they're not only fighting for themselves, but they're potentially helping others who are facing similar situations.
It's a reminder that access to justice shouldn't be a privilege, it should be a right. And a right that needs to be protected, especially for those who are already vulnerable. But okay, let's get back to the specifics of this case. What about that upcoming hearing that we talked about? The one scheduled for April 7th through the 11th. Did the estate constables, even with the EPA trying to block them at every turn, did they manage to get proper legal representation for that hearing?
That's the question everyone's asking, and unfortunately the answer is a little murky. It's unclear whether they were able to overcome those last-minute hurdles that the EPA threw their way, and even if they did, there's still the issue of the chairman who, despite the Privy Council's ruling, remained in a position of power.
So even after winning at the highest court, there's still this sense of uncertainty, a feeling that justice isn't guaranteed. It's really unsettling.
It is, and it should be. This case really exposes the flaws in our institutions, the potential for things to go wrong, even when the facts seem clear. It raises questions about accountability, transparency within organizations like the EPA and the tribunal. If this can happen in a case with this much attention, what's happening in cases that don't get this level of scrutiny?
That's a scary thought. What can we do about this? I mean, what can we as individuals do to ensure that things like this don't keep happening?
Well, awareness is key. The more we understand how these systems work, the better equipped we are to spot potential problems and hold those in power accountable. We need to push for more transparency demand reforms and support organizations that are fighting for workers' rights and equal access to justice.
Well said. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. We started with what seemed like a simple case of wrongful retrenchment and ended up uncovering a tangled web of potential corruption and obstruction of justice.
It's a story that should make us all pause and think about the systems we rely on, the institutions that we trust to uphold our rights. The estate constable's case might seem like an isolated incident, but it's a symptom of a much larger problem.
It's a call to action for all of us. We need to be vigilant, demand accountability, and fight for a system that truly delivers justice for everyone. To our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep digging into this case, learn more about the EPA, the Special Tribunal, and think about what this all means for workers' rights and the future of justice. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.